What you're looking at here is known as the Stela of Rahotep, which was carved somewhere between 1295 BC and 1188 BC during the 19th dynasty of the New Kingdom of Ancient Egypt. Rahotep was a vizier of Pharaoh Ramses II, aka Ramses the Great. And in a sense, Ramses is depicted twice in the upper portion of this stela. Here he is on the right offering food to a statue of himself. The statue is labeled with this text, which reads, Ramses Meriamun, ruler of rulers, the great god, lord of heaven forever. The lower portion of the stela shows Rahotep himself, and it reads, Giving praise to your Ka, lord of appearances, Ramses Meriamun, ruler of rulers, the great god who hears the prayers of humankind. And this reveals that the statue of Ramses is actually his Ka. But what is the Ka, and why is it depicted as a statue of the same person who's making an offering to it? Like, imagine if you were worshipping a statue of yourself. Also important to note, take a look at what's behind the statue. 4 human ears. So before I go on, I'll preface this discussion a little by saying that I came across this stela when I was doing research for a new bicameral mind video that I've wanted to make. That video itself might require a lot more time and might need to be broken down into several parts, because what I wanted it to be was an entire history of humanity from the perspective of the gods and, their influence on humanity, their commands, and their actions. That project's probably going to take a while, and I'm probably going to have to do it slightly differently than I originally envisioned, but when I found this description in a book called Ancient Egypt, Facts and Fictions, and someone on my Discord server was able to find the stela that it was referencing, I wanted to talk about it separately. So what is the Ka? You'll often see it translated as something like life force, but I think that this is a translation that we've imposed based on our own way of thinking, because we've had such a hard time understanding what the Ka actually is. I believe there are good reasons to doubt this translation. For one thing, the Ka is almost always depicted as a statue, and it's shown to be separate from the pharaoh. In fact, Egyptologists once proposed translating the word Ka as double. But because that seemed to not make sense from our modern perspective, they went with life force instead. I actually think that translating it as double is a very good first step. Because why, in this case, would Ramses' life force be in a statue rather than in himself? And secondly, the Ka was believed to continue existing even after the person died. But if life force is the correct translation, wouldn't it only exist, insofar as it is forcing someone to live? And the fact that the Ka is always depicted as the person's double makes it seem kind of strange to call the double a person's life force. Because the idea of a life force is very abstract and imaginative. If we think about early humans, the further back in history we go, we should see less and less abstract ideas because these are more cognitively complex and require greater powers of imagination. Instead, we should see more references to concrete ideas based on the world as it was directly experienced rather than imagining other ideas beyond the realm of our perceptions. Very abstract theological notions like the idea of God being omnipotent or omniscient is a lot more cognitively challenging to grasp and to conceptualize. And this is why this notion actually developed relatively recently, in contrast to the idea of gods just being, more or less really powerful people. My point is that abstraction is something which takes cognitive effort, and so earlier humans would have been less capable of spontaneously imagining ideas like that. So yes, the Ka is always depicted as a double, but the Egyptians believed that the god Khnum crafted each person on his potter's wheel. But he didn't just craft the person, he crafted the person and their Ka. And depictions of this show the Ka part of the person pointing at their own mouths, like this. Now, maybe this is a reference to the breath, as the breath might be a kind of way of understanding the life force. But there's another interpretation, which I'm going to come back to. I know most of you watching this already know where I'm going with this, but I'll still keep you in suspense for now. Now, like I said before, the Ka was believed to survive after the person died, and it was actually believed to take up residence inside a statue of the person. There are many examples of these Ka statues. And in order for the Ka to actually inhabit the statue, a ritual was performed known as the opening of the mouth ceremony. Why would a statue need to have its mouth opened? It could be so that it could breathe, but you can also breathe through your nose. The reason the mouth needed to be open is so that the statue could be allowed to speak. Egyptologists Roger Seiler and Frank Lully wrote the following. The goal was the animation of the mummy, its transformation to a medium for cultic communication, to make it able to communicate by opening their mouth and eyes. So this ceremony is what allows them to speak. Now, was this just kind of like a ceremonial or, abstract notion of speaking? Like they weren't really speaking, but we like to imagine that they are. I don't think so. I think the Egyptians were literally hearing these statues speak to them, at least from their subjective points of view. What they were experiencing was an internal auditory hallucination, which sounded like an external voice coming from the statue. And for those of you who don't know, this is known as the theory of the bicameral mind. I'll quote Julian Jaynes directly for his interpretation of what the ka was. A man's ka was his articulate, directing voice, which he heard inwardly, perhaps in parental or authoritative accents, but which when heard by his friends or relatives, even after his own death, was, of course, hallucinated as his own voice. And this explains why depictions of the ka on Khnum's potter's wheel show it pointing towards their own mouths. The ka was a person's own internal auditory hallucination. It would be like if you considered your internal monologue to be like a separate part of yourself, except that monologue would have sounded like an actual voice, as if there was someone really there speaking. The ka was considered the divine part of the pharaoh, and I think this is because it would have sounded like a god speaking from some ethereal plane, in order to issue commands to the person. And Egyptologists have found many references to the idea of the ka being divine. For example, Stephen Thomas, who wrote the book where I found the stela in the first place, wrote about the idea of gods in Egypt. The word for god in ancient Egyptian was Netcher, and the pharaohs were considered to be living Netcher. But interestingly, the dead are also referred to as Netcher, not just dead gods, but just dead regular people. Is this because the dead were now somehow considered to be like amidst the gods? I think that the reason the dead are referred to as Netcher is because after someone died, it might have been still possible to hear their voices through hallucinations, giving them the idea that they were still alive in some sense. And this is why we see that the ka is the part of the person that survives after death, because from the point of view of the ancient Egyptians, the ka was the part of a person that was still interacting with them. And this idea means that you don't need to abstract to the idea of the afterlife. It would have been something that the ancient Egyptians directly experienced, and then they just pretty much recorded their experiences. Thomas also wrote the following: "The well-being of Egypt depended on the king's ability to intercede with the gods on behalf of Egypt and its people. There were numerous rituals intended to renew or reinforce the king's relationship with the royal ka, and, therefore, reinforce his Netcherhood." So here again, we see an emphasis on the fact that the ka is separate from the pharaoh himself. It's being treated as a distinct entity. Another important point is the fact that the pharaoh's ka was passed on from pharaoh to pharaoh, and it was said to be the same ka that he was passing down. As Thomas writes, the ka was the link between the physical and spiritual worlds, and was the means by which material offerings of food and drink were transmitted to the non-material world of the gods and the dead. The royal ka was the life force that had been possessed by all the kings of Egypt, and at the coronation, this ka was passed on to the new king. It is the receipt of the royal ka that transformed the king into a Netcher, a god. This refers to how the ka had to be given food and water. So food was literally brought before the ka statue and just left there. And when the food rotted away, the Egyptians took this as a sign that it was being eaten. But my point is that it's hard to justify the translation of the word ka as life force if all of these weird rituals were taking place. I think it makes more sense that the ka was felt to still exist after death because it was a voice that could still be heard. That would convince people that the ka was still alive, which would explain why they felt the need to feed the ka. And remember, these rituals were done out of a place of sincerity. They really did see the world like this, which is fascinating to think about because it just shows how different their minds are from ours, even though we're the same species. Stephen Thomas also explains how the ka was the instrument through which the pharaoh could communicate with the other gods. This again could be a reference to this idea that the ka was like the part of the pharaoh that lived in the spirit realm, but if we take a more concrete interpretation, this is because if the gods spoke to the pharaoh, they would be speaking through his ka, through his internal auditory hallucination. And that explains why the ka was seen as the intermediary, which allowed the pharaoh to communicate with the gods. The ka spoke on their behalf, so to speak. And I'll read from Thomas again. "This stela illustrates another feature of the king's Netcherhood. As the only living person who had the status of Netcher/god, the king was the only person who could directly approach the gods. The walls of all the temples of Egypt depict the king as the only person who could stand before the gods during the rituals performed in the temples. Since the king's divinity was an acquired characteristic, it was important that the king maintain his status as Netcher throughout his life. The well-being of Egypt depended on the king's ability to intercede with the gods on behalf of Egypt and its people. There were numerous rituals intended to renew or reinforce the king's relationship with the royal ka, and therefore his Netcherhood." So this interpretation, that the Ka was the pharaoh's internal auditory hallucination, explains why the Ka is necessary for the pharaoh's divinity. It was literally his capacity to speak with the gods. I don't think this notion makes perfect sense if you translate Ka as life force. Because what exactly is the connection between one's life force and their ability to communicate with the gods? I mean, there could be a connection, maybe something like the fact that our souls come from another world, and so that's like the divine part of us. But again, that's really abstract. So I think that this alternative translation of Ka fits a lot better and requires a lot less abstraction. Now, the scholar Lanny Bell wrote a paper that is apparently very famous amongst Egyptologists, even though the vast majority of us have probably never heard of it, which talks about the cult of the royal Ka at the Temple of Luxor. The reason this paper is so significant is because nobody knew what the Temple of Luxor was being used for until this paper came out and explained what was going on. And it provides a lot of discussion about how the ancient Egyptians viewed the Ka. For example, he writes, "The concept of the Ka in Egyptian religion is a complicated one, but it may be described for the moment as a divine aspect of the king, linking him both with the gods and with all of his royal predecessors. Again, what made the Ka divine was probably the fact that it was literally heard as a god. It was experienced as this higher force speaking to you, commanding you to act, very often in a very forceful way. That would immediately make the ancient Egyptians think of the Ka as being like a god." A scholar who Lanny Bell quotes in that paper, R.T. Rundle Clark, I wonder why he refuses to use his first name, wrote this: "The king exercised supreme power in the world. He was the intermediary, whereby the divine energies of the universe were made available for men. This power he derived from his ancestors, in particular from his father, who for this reason was considered as himself divine. The deceased father in his tomb was the source of the power, called by the Egyptians the Ka." So here we see a reference to the fact that the Ka was being passed on from generation to generation, and that the pharaoh's deceased father was like the previous owner of the Ka, lending some evidence to the notion that the Ka was the part of the person that could still be experienced after a person had died. And I think that this reference here to the Ka being a source of power should be taken literally. The Ka really was the force that got things moving in ancient Egypt. It exerted power over the pharaoh, who in turn executed its authority over the people of Egypt. Remember, the pharaoh was the person who communicated with the gods in order to ask them what to do. Yes, he was like a ruler in and of himself, but he also thought of himself as more or less just an intermediary between the spirit world and the physical world. Another interesting quote from this paper: "The Ka statues of Ramses II in the niches of the temple shrine at Luxor function as intermediaries in forwarding his subjects' pleas to Amun." So what this is referring to, there are these enormous statues of Ramses II at the Temple of Luxor and also other pharaohs. And when people wanted to speak to the gods, they would first go to these Ka statues, and the Ka would be like the one to deliver the message to the gods. This is suggestive of the fact that the ancient Egyptians believed that it was the Ka that went and spoke to the gods, and then it would come back and then speak to the person to deliver the god's message, probably through an auditory hallucination. So notice how other people could speak to the Ka through the Ka statues. And an interesting note about this is that we should think about the statues as being a way to induce hallucinations. Because the ancient Egyptians genuinely believed that these statues were in some sense alive, that they possessed the Ka of the person. And so when you confronted this statue before you and you genuinely believed that it was alive, it would almost like activate a part of your mind that could produce auditory hallucinations and give you the impression that the Ka was speaking to you. And that may sound rather foreign to the way we think, but it isn't really. Because when you talk to another person, in a sense, what you're doing is projecting your kind of internal idea of them onto them, and that's the thing you're actually speaking to. So it's possible to project the idea of a kind of external entity onto a statue and then have that statue speak back to you. But in reality, that information, whatever it's saying, is just coming from your own mind. They didn't know that, but that's what was actually happening. So if we look back at this stela, there are two things that really stand out. The first is the fact that the Ka and the pharaoh are depicted as distinct entities. To me, this is evidence for his bicameral state. This means that he had a bicameral mind. His psyche was split between a man side and a god side. And in this case, the Ka was his god side. The god and the man were neurologically separated from each other through the division of the cerebral hemispheres. And the god was most likely the right hemisphere, and the man was the left hemisphere. And their separation physically and neurologically from one another would contribute to the sense of them being distinct entities from each other. And this is strong evidence that the Ka and the person were considered two distinct entities. And so this idea of it being a life force, that idea reminds me of like the idea of the soul. But it's very rare that we think of the soul and ourselves as being distinct entities. We think of them as being more or less the same. And so this separation is, to me, indicative of a bicameral state. Thomas makes a note about how the pharaoh would have felt like he was split between these two entities. That the Ka had an existence separate from the living king is visible in a stela of the vizier Rahotep, who served King Ramses II. In this stela, what appears to be Ramses II worshipping himself is really Ramses II worshipping the royal Ka, embodied in a statue of Ramses II. And the second significant thing about this picture are these 4 ears, which I think demonstrate that the Ka was heard by the pharaoh. The author himself makes a note that the ears must represent the fact that the Ka was there to listen to the pleas of the pharaoh. And that interpretation does make sense, but I would posit that a more complete interpretation would also be the fact that the pharaoh would have heard the voice of the Ka. And those 4 ears are meant to represent that, as well as the fact that the Ka would have been hearing the voice of the pharaoh. It's a two-way relationship. The Ka listens to the pleas of the pharaoh, and the pharaoh listens to the Ka's response. And remember, the whole point of that opening of the mouth ceremony was to get the Ka statues to be able to speak. That was the point of the ceremony, according to the Egyptians themselves. Now let's get into a deeper discussion about the state of human psychology at this point in Egyptian history. Because as I mentioned before, this stela was crafted during the New Kingdom of Egypt, which is the most recent out of the 3 ages or 3 eras of Egyptian history. So we should expect the mentality of consciousness, which the vast majority of us have, to be gaining in prominence. So this depiction of the Ka and of Ramses giving offerings to it could have been just a cultural tradition that was done since the earliest ages of Egypt. And the conscious Ramses himself, he was just kind of doing it out of tradition, unaware of the fact that in the past, the voices of the gods were literally heard. This isn't that surprising because even today, people still speak to the god or gods through prayer. And I think that this is actually a holdover from what's been a feature of religion since time immemorial. But the difference is, way back then, the gods would speak back, which would explain why people prayed in the first place. And so prayer actually made a lot more sense back then, and we've just been doing it for so long that we still continue to do it without realizing that its original purpose isn't being fulfilled anymore. But that's just kind of like the power of tradition and of culture. And it makes sense that back then the god would have actually spoken back to the person, because then that would explain the impetus to continue praying to the gods. And again, once that's established in your culture, it just becomes kind of a feature. And even if that bicameral mentality goes away, you still continue doing the tradition. And in some sense, you still might be reaping the benefits of praying to the gods, because again, the gods are part of your nervous system, and praying to them might be a way to kind of access the information that they have. The idea being that your ego is mostly a product of your left hemisphere, and so when you pray to this external force and try to listen to it or to listen to any signs that it could be speaking to you, you're kind of accessing the information that the other half of your mentality possesses. But again, it's not in this extremely direct way through an auditory hallucination, but it could still be maybe felt through your feelings or through your intuition. And that might explain why people still pray today. But I do think that for earlier humans, it would have made more sense for them to pray and actually literally hear the gods speaking back to them. So it's possible that Ramses himself was just going along with all of this out of tradition, because even the fact that the Ka is depicted as the king's double shows that they were at least somewhat aware of their bicameral state. They knew that they were split between these two mentalities. And I think that itself is indicative of increasing awareness, of increasing consciousness. And also the fact that they needed to perform a lot of rituals and ceremonies in order to open the mouth of the Ka statue or to reinforce the pharaoh's netzerhood might indicate that the gods were speaking less and less frequently, hence necessitating all of this extra stuff in order to get the gods to speak. So Ramses himself might have been a conscious individual, but it's also possible that Ramses was actually hearing the gods. That he was part of a lineage of people who had this special ability to speak directly with the gods. In other words, the pharaohs were schizophrenic, and they were passing on their schizophrenia to subsequent generations. The Egyptian pharaohs were very incestuous after all. So they might have been marrying their sisters to intentionally, or more likely unintentionally, pass on their ability to speak with the gods. But in any case, I think it's very likely that the pharaoh was put in his supreme position because of his ability to speak with the gods, because that's a very useful talent. And you may know this if you've watched my Shaman Kings video. I personally think, however, that Ramses, given the age in which he lived and his historical significance, was a conscious individual. but he still might have heard auditory hallucinations. In other words, he was kind of like a transitional human between bicameral and fully conscious. Just as many schizophrenics have their own egos, it's just that when they're under immense stress, their egos may evaporate, and that's when they begin to experience these voices. And so that kind of posits this idea of consciousness and the bicameral mind not necessarily being separate mentalities, but rather you could kind of transition slowly from one state to the other. And we're all a little bicameral in a sense, because we all do experience lapses of consciousness, especially when we fall asleep. You experience this entire world of these other beings who are speaking to you as if they're external presences. So we all still kind of have a link to this capacity. It's just that most of us don't experience external entities speaking to us when we're awake. It just happens when we're asleep. And I think that Egyptologists today are generally unaware of the theory of the bicameral mind. And so when they read ancient texts that tell them how the ancient Egyptians thought, they unwittingly impose their own mentalities on the ancient Egyptians in order to understand them, which is a reasonable thing to do. But again, it kind of makes the ancient Egyptians seem way more like us than they probably were. Because we aren't gripped by the gods the same way the ancient Egyptians were. For the ancient Egyptians, the gods were like the point of life. Everything occurred through the gods. The way they lived their lives was fundamentally construed by their religions. Today, most people just experience religion as something they do one day of the week. But back then, religion was like the substance of life itself. In fact, the idea of religion itself wouldn't have existed because religion would have just been life for them. So I think that if Egyptologists were introduced to this theory and it was explained properly to them and maybe they kept a bit of an open mind, it would act like a key that opens the door to many unsolved mysteries of ancient Egypt and more generally of the history of the human race. So yeah, that's what I wanted to share with you. I hope you folks who enjoy hearing about the bicameral mind enjoyed this. Please consider subscribing if you haven't already, or subbing to me on Patreon, through which you can gain access to our Discord server and continue the discussion there. Anyways, have a good day, and may good luck always come your way.